this event. It's great to see so many people here. As some of you might know, it's a kind of merger of two events, so we're kind of mixing together two book tours here. And the way we're going to format it is Richard Seymour is going to start off by giving us a short talk about his book, and then we're going to have the same thing from Peter, and then after that we'll have an opportunity for some questions from the audience. So we're just going to start off with Richard Seymour. He's an editor at Salvage magazine, and he's a writer and broadcaster, and most recently he's written this book here, which is Corbyn, The Strange Rebirth of Radical Politics. You can buy that here tonight. It's usually £13, but it's £8 for tonight. So yes,
okay, so I suppose the question I start with in the book, and it's still pretty relevant today, and it's one that we all have to deal with, is how can it be that the British Labour Party has the most left-wing social democratic leader in Europe? How can it be that the British left, after years of defeat and decline on every front, has suddenly produced the first leader, the first radical left, the first hard left leader of the Labour Party? Because even at the height of its strengths, the Labour Party has never had a powerful hard left. Right? There's always been a minority. It's always been out of power. Even this sort of Bennite surge was wildly overstated at the time, simply due to the fact that he had the backing of some influential union leaders. But basically, the Bennite movement was wildly overstated, and it never had a chance of achieving power. So this is quite a unique moment. And yet it follows a period in which, if you look on every front, the core of the labour movement, trade union density declining, secular decline for years. Strike rates, lowest levels on record, especially after 2011. There was a brief spike in 2011 when the public sector unions had a little bit of symbolic resistance to austerity, big sort of demonstrative strike actions resulting in very little practically at all. In terms of the membership of left-wing political parties, there's been a decline for decades, not just the Labour Party, in terms of the membership of its left-wing, but of all left-wing political parties, there's been an implosion. And of course, the implosion of the Trotskyist groupuscules and parties was sort of the final phase of that. Decline in left-wing publications. Most of the left-wing publications started to die out from the 1980s onwards, in terms of readership, in terms of the actual number of them, and so on. So we got to a stage in 2015 when things were looking pretty bleak. The Tories had just won an election after implementing austerity. It wasn't full-on austerity, but they got elected with the Liberals, detoxified themselves, and then won an election by themselves after implementing cuts. After some of the longest period of declining living standards that British workers have faced for a long time, we ended up with a Conservative government. And it looked as though, in 2015, the Blairites were going to be the major ones to benefit. And if you look at the arguments that were coming out, overwhelmingly it was Ed Miliband screwed it up because he was too left-wing. Red Ed spoiled Labour's leadership, election chances. And when Jeremy Corbyn was standing as a potential leadership candidate, I mean, this is before he even got on the ballot, nobody in his campaign team, least of all him, expected him to get on the ballot. Because the whole point about the Labour Party leadership elections is that there is a veto. The Parliamentary Labour Party has a veto on who gets on the ballot. You need to have, I think since the Collins reforms, you need to have 15% of Labour MPs nominate you to even get on the ballot. So there was a sense that they wouldn't even get that many MPs to say Jeremy Corbyn can be one of the candidates and participate in the debate. But already, even at this stage, there was the beginnings of a kind of ferment that hadn't been there in previous left-wing leadership campaigns, like, for example, John McDonnell's campaign, short-lived as it was. the attempt to mount a campaign from the left on an anti-capitalist platform didn't get anywhere. This time, there was already a little bit of a ferment. And initially, it was just a ferment of saying, we don't want another Labour leadership election in which all the three candidates are pretty identical, all the arguments are coming from the right, we've heard them all before, everybody's going to be turned off, everybody's going to be bored stiff. Can we not at least have a little bit of variety in this debate? And Jeremy Corbyn probably seemed to them like a safe way to have variety, because there was no chance he was going to win. Luke Akehurst from Labour First said, I want Jeremy Corbyn to be on the ballot because we need to see these ideas defeated in an open contest. Well, it didn't quite work out like that, but essentially that was the idea. So, quite a lot of people who voted for Corbyn to get on the ballot, there was a Newcastle MP who wrote a blog about it, saying, basically, I just had hundreds of emails saying, can we please have him on the ballot? I don't agree with his policies, but I'm going to nominate him so that at least we have the debate. And that's what happened. He gets on the ballot. The next thing he has to do is not just win over the membership and attract new members, but he also has to win over the trade unions. And then he has to win over some sort of wider media cultural battle. Well, how does he do that? Trade unions in this country have never, ever, ever backed the radical left candidate for the Labour leadership. They just don't do it. In their history, they always select either the centre candidate or the right-wing candidate in exchange for a little bit of quid pro quo. All right? Give us some humane policies that we can sell to our members as gains, and we will support you and not embarrass you in any way. Even in the New Labour period, when the unions were becoming more and more politicised in response to New Labour's terrible policies governing from the right, they still reached the Warwick Agreement, a classic corporatist agreement where you sit down with the Labour leadership and you say, give us a few decent policies, and in that case, we won't embarrass you on Iraq, and we won't embarrass you on the marketisation and privatisation of the public sector. And so they went into the 2005 election keeping their mouths shut about those issues, even though they were very big issues at the time. So basically the unions have never been this force for radical change, either on the Labour Party or more generally, and yet this is how they behaved in the 2015 election. And I think you have to look at it in terms of their existential crisis. Okay? And by that, I don't just mean that they have had declining union membership and declining union density and all the rest of it. Their situation as a political factor, as the major factor in the constitution of the Labour Party, as essentially the Labour Party being their party, as opposed to them just being a client, was under threat. Tony Blair had attempted to transform the Labour Party into the Democratic Party of the US, sort of modelled along those lines, had attempted to reduce the unions to the status of another client who could give a little bit of money, get a little bit of policy in return. Hadn't been entirely successful, but all the changes were moving in the wrong direction. And they had put up with the New Labour experiment, and then they put up with Ed Miliband, with a leader who comes from the soft left, who is sympathetic to the soft left, who's not anti-union. He's bound to give us a reasonable opportunity to have some sort of policy influence. Instead, what they get is the Collins Review, as I mentioned. The Collins Review is driven by a false controversy. If you remember the Falkirk controversy, where allegedly Unite was engaged in rigging ballots. Well, it did turn out to be true, but these allegations were used to justify a right-wing attack on the union role within the Labour Party. And so they've got to a situation where, come 2015, they haven't been able to fight against austerity. Their membership is going down. Their ability to do anything with their membership in terms of industrial action is increasingly weakened. And their role within the historically their party is being greatly reduced. That's what I mean by an existential crisis. So for the first time, they decide to back the candidate whose policies are closest to union policy. There's another factor as well, of course. Actually, if you look at what's going on, there's been a shift to the left at the base of the trade unions since 1997, actually, since the beginning of the New Labour experience. You could possibly trace it before then, but the point is that New Labour drove a lot of trade unions to the left. and that resulted in the election of sort of the so-called awkward squad. But it also meant that when they came into this leadership election, their computer systems were telling them who their members were logging on to vote for. So they could see where the stats were telling them. The stats were telling them that overwhelmingly their members were logging on to vote for Corbyn. Now, union leaders, as out of touch as they can be, they have to be thinking about their ability to communicate with their own membership apart from anything else. So, apart from all the structural and contextual factors inclining them to support the radical left candidate for the first time, there was a simple fact that their members were pushing them in that direction. Even Dave Prentice had to think about this, but of course he had an election coming up. So, two steps. First of all, we got him on the ballot, and we got union backing for the first time. Then there's the shift in the membership. And this comes from much wider and more diffuse processes. You can start by looking at what happens to a combination of the credit crunch on the one hand and broader social demographic shifts on the other. So the social demographic shift is you've got younger people more and more going through higher education, more and more inclined to a kind of social liberalism, not necessarily leaning to the left. But then you've got the credit crunch and subsequent austerity processes and the changes to the structure of British employment, meaning that increasingly more and more young people are locked out of the employment system, they're locked out of the property market, the apparatuses of so-called meritocracy, whereby if you go to university and work hard, you know, you'll at least have a chance, that's the idea, that's being eviscerated. So if you're a working class young person, increasingly, your chances are looking pretty forlorn. So that's one part of the radicalisation, you know, and you saw some of this in the build-up to the Labour leadership election, because shortly after the election defeat, Labour's election defeat, there was a big and rather angry anti-austerity protest in the heart of London for the first time in years. After 2011, the left had been pretty much absent from the scene. The major driving force in UK politics between 2011 and 2015 was UKIP. With predictable consequences. But suddenly in 2015, there's this revival of some sort of political protest and militancy. Okay. And once they get into the Labour Party, they fuse with the older, extant, hard left networks that have been around for a long, long time. They didn't die, they just went underground. They would turn up at People's Assembly protests and what have you, and just not say they were in the Labour Party, but they were in the Labour Party. You know, so essentially you had a fusion of those two elements to create the sort of pro-Corbyn bloc within the constituency membership. Important to say, by the way, that the new members, by and large, ideologically, not doctrinaire hard-wingers, left-wingers at all. Not particularly necessarily, I mean, radicalising, moving in a left-wing direction, but could be pulled in lots of other directions too. Okay, so that's that part of it. But then there's, of course, a wider media and cultural battle to be fought. And for Jeremy Corbyn, it's quite important that he doesn't fight the media battle in the same way that the other candidates would. The other candidates would seek to do the typical thing. You try to select some thematics that come from the centre, that link your left-wing ideas and policies to the centre, if you've got any left-wing ideas and policies, and that make sense within the media spectacle, within the pattern of received opinion. If Jeremy Corbyn does that, he doesn't have a chance. Because the whole point about Jeremy Corbyn is that his base consists very largely of young people and older people who basically are sick to death of the media. They don't trust the media, they don't like what the media says, they don't want somebody who sounds like a standard media politician. So, in essence, what Jeremy Corbyn does is he goes out and says what's on his mind. He says what he thinks, and he speaks with what I think a New Yorker writer described as kind of priestly clarity. He sums up his politics in very simple slogans. If anybody else said something about the politics of kindness, you'd never stop throwing up. Jeremy Corbyn says it, it's kind of, well, that's kind of his politics. That's him, essentially. You kind of believe it. You still want to throw up, but you also feel kindly towards him, right? So essentially, he's coming out as an advocate for a group of people who've never particularly liked neoliberal capitalism and suddenly now have a kind of representative and who are now coming out of the woodworks partly because of the damage that's been done to them through years of austerity and all the rest of it. Okay? So it's that minority. I mean, it's not a majority of British society, but it's a radicalising minority. Maybe about a third of British society is moving in this direction. Okay, and so he's winning this battle partly just by saying what's on his mind. The other thing about it is, I mean, I've been talking about what enabled him to get to this sort of situation, but we've also got to take into account the innovation of the Labour right. And, you know, we can talk about a number of the factors for that. Scotland's a big part of that. Because, of course, Scotland was always the bastion of the Labour right. And in 2014, they screwed up massively by running a campaign, a pro-union campaign which refused to distinguish itself in very important ways from the Conservatives. Sorry, and in that way alienated quite a large part of their heartland vote. But essentially the wipeout of the Labour Party in Scotland in 2015 meant, was a serious disorienting and damaging blow to the whole infrastructure of the Labour right, such that when they came up against Corbyn they were in a weakened state. But also, more generally, by that time there had been a serious degeneration. Most of the people who came up in the New Labour era on the right were special advisors, you know, people from a gilded generation of, they never had to do politics in any real sense, like talk to audiences. They never had to defend their ideas, they assumed that was already done. So it was just a question of coming up with a good PR strategy. And if you remember Liz Kendall's advertisements, where she's sitting in front of the computer saying, "I won't stop ever," essentially that was her message, and there was nothing behind it. When Jeremy Corbyn got in a debate with them, there was a notorious instance on London radio LBC, where essentially they were all asked the same question: would you have Ed Miliband in your shadow cabinet? And they all avoided the question apart from Jeremy Corbyn. He just gave a straightforward answer. And it was symptomatic of the whole thing. Even when he talked about more substantive things like austerity, they couldn't find out how to disagree with him. They couldn't muster a coherent campaign. They were actually, the Corbyn campaign was seriously surprised by how weak the Labour right were in this context. Now, of course, you've got to bear in mind the fact that they decided to split up their campaign into three campaigns. Or at least they couldn't overcome that splitting, as they tried to do this year. So there was this innovation of the Labour right on the one hand, their disorganisation, their losses, and then going into the kind of complacent assumption that they had an entitlement to rule, which indeed still seems to be the case. And there's the constitution, very germinal, of a new left under Jeremy Corbyn's campaign. Okay, so that gets us to as far as Jeremy Corbyn actually winning. But what is it symptomatic of? What is the broader picture? Because when we talk about class struggle in this country, quite often we think about trade unions, we think about picket lines and all the rest of it, and that's a big part of it. But of course, you know, at a certain level, class struggle is fought out. I mean, the highest level in a way, class struggle is fought out politically at the level of party politics and things like that. Not just parliament, I mean, you know, in terms of just being politically organised. And I think what's happened in the last 30 years or so, but increasingly and with an accelerating rate in the last few years, has been a slow degeneration of the main form of bourgeois political organisation, which is parliamentary democracy. Right? By that I mean, essentially, there's been declining voter participation, declining party membership, declining party identification, and this is happening across all the core industrial democracies, and it particularly affects the poor and the working class, and therefore it has disproportionate consequences for social democratic parties. Essentially what's happening is that there's a large part of the electorate that is increasingly excluded. They're not represented, therefore they don't bother to vote. Right? And on the other side of that, of course, you've got an increasing withdrawal of politicians into the state. One a crude example of that, look before the 2015 general election. Nick Clegg is coming up to the general election knowing that he's going to get annihilated. He sees the Lib Democide right in front of him. They're talking about polling figures in the range of 8%, and I think that's what they got in the end. And hardly any seats. I think they got 8 seats. And he knows this is coming. And he says, any government without the Liberal Democrats will not be a legitimate government. Well, why does he think that? He thinks that because, well, the Liberal Democrats are potential kingmakers, and because we've got people on select committees, and because we've built up good alliances, cross-party alliances. So in essence, what I'm saying is that the decline of bourgeois democracy, representative democracy, whatever you want to call it, is one in which there's been a mutual withdrawal, okay? And one of the things that does, one of the things that has done everywhere, has been that people, in moments of crisis, have been willing to look for a new representative, okay? So they don't feel represented. But they also don't trust, and I mentioned this about the media, they don't trust the representation of representation. The media is supposed to show you what you look like, right? It's an image of yourself. This is the argument you're having. I mean, if you watch Newsnight, does that look like you? If you watch Channel 4 News, does that look like the kind of argument that you're having? It looks like the kind of argument that a small sort of political media class, we'll call it that, has been having amongst themselves. And it's not surprising, therefore, that when they look at someone like Jeremy Corbyn, they can't make sense of him. He may as well come from Mars for all they care, because essentially he's talking about things that are completely outside their conversation. So there's been this decline in the representative structures, and that's created an opening, not just for kind of populist challengers of the types of Podemos and so on, and even to an extent Bernie Sanders, but also for challengers from the radical left. And I think that if you situate it in that context, it's easier to understand how Jeremy Corbyn was able to see off the coup. Right? I'll wrap it up here, actually, because that sort of can bring us up to date, if you like. How did Jeremy Corbyn see off the coup? Any other leader of the Labour Party who had faced that level of opposition and that kind of opposition would have resigned. What they did was a very well orchestrated